right in.
Right.
First one, what is consciousness?
What is consciousness?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Okay. My conceptualization of it, the way I tend to think of it is, I think the simplest description of consciousness is awareness. And I see that as manifesting on multiple layers. Like there's an awareness of actuality, there's an awareness of environment, there is an awareness of self, and then I think there is an awareness of possibilities of what can be done with that. And then I think the other layer, which is probably the trickiest, is the accuracy of our awareness, because a lot of people, I think in consciousness work, where I see the real difficult, challenging stuff is like you have the subconscious that steps in and layers things on top of a quote-unquote objective reality, and then most people take that compressed perception of reality as if the entire thing is actual objective reality, and they're frequently completely blind to the layers of assumption or prejudice or presumption that they layer on top of it. And so where I think the focus of consciousness work is, at least where we are in this day and age, is in expanding our awareness, but the trickiest part of that groundwork is, I think, the awareness of ourselves, internal awareness.
Yeah, because that is, I mean, we're conditioned, and with beliefs, we're conditioned with all kinds of any number of, from our parents, our teachers, from society at large, on what clothes to wear, we're told this is the best music, this is the right thing, and these are all beliefs that get superimposed on top of they become our ego, and then we believe that's it.
Right.
And then, but consciousness is this, it precedes all that, and it supersedes all that at
Right.
the same time. And and it's just a matter of, as we were talking earlier about the idea that spirituality, so much of spiritual work or consciousness work is letting go or unlearning everything we learned throughout
Right.
our life, letting it all go, and connecting to those dots, and saying, oh, this is fact, and this was belief, and
Right.
letting it all go, and understanding that those beliefs have a purpose and they have a role to play, but ultimately they are just that, they're just a tool to get us to a certain place.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, I like the idea of just the idea of just connecting it to awareness, and then all the different levels of awareness, because that's the bringing it down to a language that we can all relate to.
Yeah.
And but I think maybe a side note on that would be, and this is a matter of debate, was where does consciousness come from?
Mm.
That's one I have fun with. I like to think that consciousness is just, it is, and we tap into it. That that we are, our brain is more just an antenna, and so that it is this unified consciousness that we can tap into. It's a theory that I like to work with,
Mm-hmm.
but I haven't, again, you can't necessarily prove it, but they also can't prove that consciousness comes out of the brain.
Right.
That it's a product of the brain, or is it just, it's one of those, it's like a television, the turn off a TV or a tube break, well, it shows my age, but TV's, something's not working, that doesn't mean that the signal's not out there. It's just,
Right.
it's not picking it up. So you fix the TV and it picks up the signal again. I think, when something damages the brain, we lose the signal, or it
Yeah.
gets distorted or something like that, and that we then can pick it up. So it's always there, and it's just a matter of where we're at on our level of awareness, our level of consciousness, that determines where we are, where our, what we're sinking into, and how much awareness of what's out there is there. And,
Yeah.
which is why there's no limit to the levels of consciousness. It keeps, in my view, it just kind of keeps going. We get to a certain level, and then there's another level beyond that, because our awareness can keep expanding.
Yeah.
And because if the universe isn't infinite, then we just keep expanding.
Yeah. I kind of conceptualize in this question of where does consciousness come from. I think a way of looking at it that sort of works for my brain or I guess is a useful way, would be a better way of saying it, a useful way for my brain is, I sort of think of all of reality as like this one big amoeba. And it shapes and contorts itself in different ways, and it has like antennae that shoot out. So if we kind of compare that to the human body, you know, there's me, my whole body, and then there's my arm. And if you look at it, my arm is kind of a thing, but it's also a part of me.
Yeah.
And then it splits out, and then you've got individual fingers. So you can look at me from the perspective of the whole and the totality of me, or you could run your awareness down and say, take a perspective from your little bitty finger, looking back at self, which is going to be a different perspective. And so I sort of see consciousness as being this huge amoeba, and what we perceive is just where we tune the focus of what we're looking at. It's like you can look through a telescope and be micro-focused on something. Well, everything outside of that doesn't exist in that moment.
Yeah.
All that exists is what's right there under the telescope or the microscope. On the other hand, you could put on a pair of binoculars, and all that's going to exist is the field of view that you're picking up, and all this microscopic stuff that you were just paying attention to, it now no longer exists. It's not present in your focus.
Yeah.
So for me, consciousness is like this huge lens that you can adjust, and you can narrow it down to the very specific, and you get really contracted and you're down into the zone of ego, or you can open the aperture wide up and, you know, look at the really big picture. But you know, with consciousness, I think one of the sayings that I really like is, when we're trying to figure out what consciousness is, the thing that we're looking for is what we're looking with. And it's kind of an adjustment to shift to looking at it that way, but that's how I conceptualize it.
Yeah, and that's why so much of the work is being able to get beyond the ego.
Right.
So that, because the ego, I mean, it's a lens. Everything, all our beliefs are just lenses.
Right.
That, you know, and it focuses it. So the more the lenses we can, you know, remove, it kind of expands it. And when you're talking, it reminded me of that experiment, the gorilla experiment. Have you ever seen the videos of that?
No.
It was a great experience in psychology and focus. You know, so people were given, there's like a circle of people, and they're given, a basketball, and they're dressed in different colors, like black and white.
Oh, I have seen that. Yeah.
And there's like, okay, counts how many times people in the white, bounce the ball or whatever, how many times they pass it. And during the whole thing, in the video, somebody in a gorilla suit comes by.
Yeah.
And over 90% of people don't ever see that gorilla because they're so focused on the basketball, doing their task,
right,
what they were told to do, that they don't even notice that a gorilla walks by. And
right,
it's amazing. I love doing that, because people see it, and it's like, okay, how many times did it pass? And we have that discussion now. Now, how many people saw the gorilla? And they're like, what gorilla?
Yeah, what are you talking
okay,
about?
now watch it again.
Yeah.
This time, don't count, just watch. And it's the exact same stream, and it's like, they can't believe that they did not see this gorilla. And I see that, so much in life. People, they're so focused on whatever it is they're told. They were told by their teachers and by parents or preachers what to focus on, and that they don't see the gorillas. They don't see all the gorillas that are out there, all the wonderful gorillas. They don't see it because of their focus is so narrow.
Yeah.
And so we just, consciousness is just about expanding our awareness, and so that we see those gorillas. And and we can only see what we can see, but and that's why we have each other, because I'm only going to see certain gorillas,
right,
and you're going to see certain gorillas,
right.
But through communication, through communion, we now can talk about all the different gorillas we see. I didn't see that one, and now I've expanded my awareness because we have talked, and because here you hear my story, I hear yours, and now awareness is even more. And that's why I think communities are so important in talking. It's not just about I'm expanding my consciousness by myself. I need to do it in community, because that's the only way to really truly expand it beyond my narrow scope. Yeah. That all sounds good.
And I think that's a good lead into the next question, which is what exactly does raising consciousness mean?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think, what does it mean? I think we kind of talked about that a little bit, about, it means, expanding our awareness, expanding our narrow focus to be as broad as it can be. And I like to talk about it in, in circles, concentric circles, or, some, literature in the holons, expanding our circles of awareness, expanding our circles of care and support for, as broad as it can be. We're born at a phase where all we know, there is no differentiation between us and everybody. And then we start to differentiate. And now we have our little narrow circle of family. And as we grow, we keep expanding that to our friends and, and then to our cities and our states. And, we connect, we identify with all these broader circles. And, then our goal, I think, is to then keep expanding that so that it is as broad as it can be. And through time, we get to, actually care about people we can never meet around the world. And we start to care about the environment, start caring about other animals, and, so that it's not just about, so to me, it's just keep expanding who we care about. And it's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's a way of, that's how we can get to a place where it does matter that somebody in India is starving to death right now, and it matters to me, and I can feel that pain. And that's not easy for everybody. And
Right.
So it just keeps, just keep expanding, so it really does matter, and recognize that we are all connected in a really deep and serious way.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's when so many of the problems in our world right now are due to the lack of awareness, lack of connection with people we don't know.
Right. And that kind of carries us into the next question. And I very much agree with what you said. But the next question is, why should people care? Why should the average person care about raising consciousness? I mean, and I try and look at this from a very pragmatic standpoint, and it was kind of revolutionary to me when I connected these dots. But when I stand back and say, why should the average person care about, what you just said about why is it important to be aware of what's happening on the other side of the world? Why should I care? Well, the conclusion that I've come to, and I think there's been some research that validates this, and I've done a study, and I can talk about that a little bit, but there's this real interesting dynamic in raising consciousness, which is if a person raises their consciousness, not only do they get what you just talked about, which is they become aware of a much larger circle of reality, and it matters to them and it becomes important to them, but what also happens is at the same time, as they raise their consciousness, it makes their happiness go up.
Yeah.
Because in expanding their awareness of their environment, invariably hand in hand with that, they expand their awareness of themselves. And as they expand their awareness of themselves, a lot of things happen. One, internal conflict is decreased because they become more coherent. They move closer and closer to the whole of their being, acting together in harmony in a unified fashion. So internal conflict decreases, wasted energy decreases because they're not operating on conflicting agendas within themselves. Fear decreases because as we transcend the ego, the things that we view as being threats to us, who or what we are, those decrease because we develop a much larger sense of self. And so our vulnerability decreases, so our fear decreases. And there's many other things that go along with that, but as all these things add up, and the other thing that we find out is as people raise their consciousness, and I want to talk about more of this later, hopefully I won't forget. If I do, remind me, we'll come back about it. We'll come back and talk about it, but as people raise their consciousness, they increase the skills that they can utilize and deploy in life to live a successful life and to live the life that they really truly want. They have a better understanding of what it is they really want, but they're also better equipped to get it. So we've got this weird dual benefit thing with raising consciousness, which is if I raise my consciousness, not only do I become more concerned about my brother, my distant brother, and feel more affinity with them, I'm also making my life better and making me happier. So it's really a win-win.
Yeah, and I agree in general with that. It's one of those things I think of, like certain conditions right now in South America, where there's a lot of debate about contacting this tribal group that it basically has remained isolated. And I'm not sure that them, and of course they're at a level of consciousness that is consistent with their living
Right.
at the tribal level. Once they get brought into the mess of the world, then they're not going to be happier. And that in this case, and I think you can probably find isolated cases in people's lives where if, without the cognitive dissonance of that is modern society, I think they're better off and it could be happier at their level. But I think, and I think I've come to more agree with you in the sense, because when I look at society and see that, there is no isolation anymore.
Right.
If you once, one time you could, I think of this area that we're in now that for a long time was isolated, relatively isolated. They were, hours away from any major city. They're here, and people, remained pretty constant, and there wasn't a lot of influx of, stuff from the outside world.
Right.
So things could be the way it was, and it was a very it is, still a very traditional level of consciousness that predominates here. But now there's a lot of dissonance because there's an oil boom, so people are coming in from all over the country and all over the world, bringing in all kinds of different ways of doing things. Now, the young people, not just television anymore, now there's with the internet and everything else, they're exposed to a lot more information. And to stay in that traditional level of consciousness is painful.
Mm-hmm.
It is literally painful to stay in that because you have to fight to keep out all that other information that contradicts your traditional beliefs. And so, and when I first moved here 4 years ago, there was a rash of suicides, young people on high school, and several of them all tied together. And I think to me that was part of that pain, the growing pains of this new raising consciousness, and because it doesn't happen without pain. So we say you can be happier, but then you have to go through sometimes go through a lot of garbage and to let go of it in order to get to that new level of happiness. And
Right.
That's consistent with all spiritual paths. Nobody is no serious spiritual path says it's going to be an easy thing to get to there.
Right.
It takes work, it takes effort, but it's happening to people now without their awareness that what they're doing, what's going on in their lives.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm, because in general though, I think I'm coming to agree more and more with you just as I think about it, in that it's really going to be hard for people at the traditional level and I think going forward into the rational level that can stay happy given changes going on in the world, and because it takes a lot of work to stay at that level when you keep on getting bombarded with new ideas and new expansion, and as young people are moving forward and they're rising up to pluralistic and integral levels at a much younger age,
Mm-hmm.
and people are going to be left behind,
Mhm.
and that's not going to be an easy feeling either, and again we're creating more cognitive dissonance, and then and that's just a miserable way to be. So I think we're coming to more in agreement with that. Because the larger perspective of things are changing too fast now, and we can't. I've always said that people, if they're at the traditional level and they're happy, then keep them there. But I think it's too hard now. I think if in Midland, Texas, that's becoming an impossibility,
Mhm.
and to stay happy that way, then it's going to be pretty much anywhere that's connected to the rest of the world. The more connected we are, the harder it is for people to stay there
Yeah.
and to be happy at that level.
Yeah.
It's just too hard, given everything going on in the world and all the information that is out there, and to keep kids, I mean, basically a child would have to be totally isolated from the internet and from television to know, to be able to stay there peacefully, and, you know, which maybe not a bad thing. I'm not saying, you know, maybe we should be, you know, but the fact is this is our world, and I think you're right that and the more I think about it, the more it is important that we do really actively work to raise consciousness and to a place so that people can find peace and happiness.
You know, one of the things that I did, which was kind of interesting, is it certainly was not rigorous enough to be scientifically reliable, but I assembled a focus group of about 30 people, and I surveyed them very extensively. It was a lot of questions. I asked them, I think, about something like 23 areas of their life. How happy are you with this? How happy are you with this? How happy are you in this area? And I would have them scale it on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 being blissfully happy and 1 being absolutely miserable with it. And then I asked them a whole bunch of questions to try and nail down where their predominant level of consciousness was in viewing the world and interacting with the world. And so the way I conceptualize the progression of consciousness, I break it down into 7 layers, which are arbitrary, you know, layers. You can divide the cake in as many slices as you want, but I think 7 is a good number to work with. So I break it down into 7, and I tried to identify through these questions what level they predominantly identified. And the base level of being, you know, a purely egoistic outlook as being a 1, and then if they were up at the transcendent level of consciousness or universal consciousness, whatever that is, then that would be a 10. And so I scaled their level of consciousness on a scale of 1 to 10, and what I found was their level of happiness on a scale of 1 to 10 there was an 80% probability it would be within like 9 points of their level of consciousness. So there was this data that says wherever your level of consciousness, odds are very high your happiness is going to be within about 10 points of that.
So there's at least a corollary effect. If
Yes.
not a cause and effect, there's at least a correlation between the
Yes.
two. I think that sounds, you know, reasonable. I think, you know, because also the more conscious, the more aware you are, the more, you know, you're going to seek to be happy.
Well,
You're gonna recognize, you know, holding on to that grudge is not adding to my happiness.
exactly.
And so I can let go of that grudge. I can
Exactly.
forgive
Right.
and be happier for it.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think, there's a lot of that definitely going on.
Yeah. Let's see. I've done 3. You pick one.
All right. Well, this is interesting. What provokes spiritual growth at each of the stages of consciousness?
Ooh, that is a good one. You want to start on that, or you want me to start on that?
I can start.
Okay.
Because I've seen this, and I've, you know, my own life, and I've seen it in others, and in my role, that it's almost always going to be something has just shaken your worldview. Whatever level you are, whatever your worldview is at that, you know, whatever level, something has happened to create a cognitive dissonance. Something doesn't jive. You got introduced to a theory, you know, for me, it's as junior high level, you know, getting introduced to evolution. It's like, and it created cognitive dissonance between what I was taught in my religious school, and said, wait a minute, this is, you know, and that created then, that pushed me, at a very early age, out of, you know, traditional mindset into the more rational mindset, because I couldn't bring those two things together. Mm-hmm. And it was a painful, you know, it's almost never going to be a good thing. It's always something that's like, And because you have to let go of everything you've been taught, everything you believe to be true.
Mhm.
And I didn't, and of course it didn't all happen at once, but I had to start letting go of things everything I'd been taught. I've been taught all these different things about God. I've been taught all these different things about, our different roles but then, evolution, says, no, this is different. And so it was, and that was, again, at one stage of development, but in every stage of my life, that I can look back on now and said, this was, something happened that I could not explain, with my old worldview.
Mhm.
And so now I needed to seek out a new worldview, not necessarily consciously, but that's what I was doing, because I was trying to get rid of that cognitive dissonance.
Right.
It doesn't feel good to be in that place of not knowing. So I'm like, what moves me to the next? So until I find that next place, and then it's like, oh, okay, and then I can find that peace. And then, of course, and each answer leads to then another problem.
Right.
And so you have now, that'll get to a place, and then you start having doubting about that worldview, and then you move on to the next place and to the next place. And so it's always been, for me, a problem that's happened, that's pushed me forward. And sometimes, and until you get to a place where then you can create that on your own.
Mhm.
You can actually look, when at a certain level of consciousness, you can actually start to say, okay, there's the problem I'm going to encounter. What's the answer to that? And you can now, at a certain level, start to then engage it in a different way, because now you're in charge of it instead of it happening to you.
Yeah.
At the earlier stages. Now you can start to direct it and recognize that this is what I'm going to do, and put yourself in circumstances that challenge your worldview, so that you can, because if we're just in 100% agreement with each other, and we're in an echo chamber, then there's nobody, and there's no disagreement at all, then okay, everybody, we might feel good about ourselves about it, but no growth is happening.
Right.
So putting yourself in a position where people will actually disagree with you and challenge you on things, this is one of the ways I do it, as in my role as a minister, is to be challenged. And now I have to, so it's something I seek to do,
Right.
challenge me on this, question me on this, because it helps me in my own work.
Yeah.
When you find holes in my logic,
Right.
it helps me.
Right.
And I see it as a good thing when you say you don't agree with me,
Yeah.
and I want to know why.
Yeah.
And because it's important for me, and sometimes I might just see it as, well, it's from their perspective, they don't recognize what I'm seeing, but it also forces me then to at least how to talk about it in such a way that it's more understandable for people at different levels of awareness.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I think I'd probably verbalize it a little bit differently. I'm basically saying the same thing you are. I'm just wrapping it in a little bit different wrapper. And this is partly to address whoever might be listening to this. But one of the things that I have found that precipitates growth, you talked about cognitive dissonance, and I very much agree with that. But at the early stages of growth, many times what I see precipitating growth is a very painful experience with life. And I've seen many people in this position, and the bad news is it can be very painful, it can be very depressing, it can feel very hopeless, it can be a very low place to be. But the good news about it, which when you're early in your growth and you don't understand this is where you are, the good news about it is you figured out that your way of trying to view or interact with the world is not working. And you know it's broken, but until you have the recognition and the belief, there's something better. Once I break out of this room, there's something better on the other side of that door. It's very scary. And so I see a lot of times growth being triggered by very difficult things. I mean, you hear all the time about a near-death experience triggering growth, or the death of a loved one triggering growth, or even, there's a lot of spiritual leaders who fought depression early in their life. And it's this thing of you've grown too big for the confines that your intellectual world has given you to that point, and you know it's broken and you know it's not going to work, and it's depressing up until you figure out, hey, there's a better approach to this. Then once you do, and you kick through that door and you get on the other side, then it's really good because you're open to a new and more effective way of viewing reality and interacting with reality and whatever. So I see pain and despair a lot of times being the catalyst for that, and I've seen a lot of people in depression that they don't recognize the good news about the difficulty of their situation, but there is a ray of hope.
Yeah, and that, I'm in agreement because, I think, my own past was, I suffered from a lot of depression. And until I recognized that my depression was, it was there for a reason. It's not a disease in and of itself, it's a symptom. And a symptom that's pushing us to find out what's going on, what's wrong.
Right.
And and for me there was a disconnect between my values and my beliefs and the life that I was living.
Right.
And so I needed to bring my life into accord with my values.
Right.
And then I don't have depression anymore.
Right.
Now, this isn't the case in all depression. There are some chemical imbalances. But, this is my fear, my worry about so many people medicating their depression instead of recognizing it as an opportunity to make some corrections, some changes in their
Right.
life. And we're trying to mask the symptoms and no, let it,
I agree.
let it work it out and see it as a tool to say something's wrong and fix it. It's like a pain. The pain is, in our body there for a reason to tell us something's not right.
Right.
And so instead of, don't just take a pill to make the pain go away. Say, why is this pain going on?
Right.
And make adjustments so that there's something in balance. To fix the imbalance. And so it's a new way of looking at things for a lot of people. But
Yeah.
it's instead of saying all these things are the problem, they're the pathway. The depression for me was the path.
Right.
Of this. Instead of fighting the depression, I said, all right, I'm depressed. And then let myself be depressed. And then each time looking forward saying, well, what can I change? What's one thing I could do when I'm done being depressed?
Mm-hmm.
And actually gave myself something to do, to work on. And that actually led me out of my depression.
Yeah.
And then each one, depressions got shorter and lesser as I kept working on things.
Right.
And sometimes it meant getting a new job.
Right.
And sometimes it meant, just getting outside my comfort zone a lot.
Right.
But each step, and it doesn't all happen at once, but each step helped me get out of it. And so I said, I may have normal up and downs, but I don't have depression anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I've lost jobs over, depressive episodes because I couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks. And
Yeah.
so, employers don't like that.
Right.
But, it was, once I recognized that it was an opportunity, it changed everything.
Yeah, I totally agree. I had a similar experience. I battled with depression. All of mine, I'm simplifying this down a little bit, but I think the essence of mine was what happened is I had constructed a view of reality that did not work. And my depression grew out of the fact that I knew it was broken. I just didn't know how to fix it. So it was a catalyst for growth, and it's what pushed me forward. And I have to be real careful about this because I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not qualified to make any kind of psychiatric diagnosis. But speaking from my own experience and what I've seen in working with people from a spiritual level, I think the vast majority of depression is not a chemical thing. I think it is a sign that their intellectual conceptualization of reality is broken, and it's causing them pain, and it needs to evolve. And so, in some ways, it can be depression can be taken as a compliment, and it's like your soul saying, hey, it's time for you to grow. You have outgrown this old way of doing things. You're becoming a bigger, more evolved, more advanced being. Yeah. And it's like trying to wear your 2-year-old clothes at 5 years old. They don't feel good.
Yeah. Or the toys you played with at 7, you don't play with at 10 or 12 because you've progressed.
Exactly.
You are and there's, we understand that, and we think that once you get to adult, boom, we're done, making progress.
Right.
But we're not. It's a lifelong a journey that we're on that, can go on. And, and so much, we haven't been living as long as we are now for very long.
Right.
And so that's why so much of this is new, is because we're living longer. People are experiencing more. And so they're getting, as they get into their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s and beyond, there's more potential for growth because, there's just more to see, more to do, and things are changing. And this wasn't an issue a couple hundred years ago because people did, the world was more simple. Everything was more simple, and we didn't live as long generally, and it was just, so much of life, up until very recently was just about survival.
Yeah.
And now we can go beyond survival into thriving, as and expanding our awareness. And it's such a great opportunity, but we're still very young and very new at this, and we're still figuring it out as we go along. And it is a challenge.
Yeah. And I also agree with what you said about cognitive dissonance. And for me, I found in my journey that in the early stages, it was usually pain that caused me to evolve. But as I got more advanced and I progressed, and I'd like to think I've grown some. Yeah. And as I've done that, the primary catalyst for my growth has been cognitive dissonance. And I've kind of been in this path of I want to find out first what I've got to do is I've got to make sure I understand what's objectively real and what is what I have created and layered on top of that. What have I assumed about reality? What are the lenses that I've put on to view reality? But in looking at it, I keep pursuing this idea of what is something that you can stand on that is true in all contexts. And I've come to see as the years have gone by, what I thought went in that box gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And so, like you said, I've had to let go of a whole lot of things, and it's been really freeing in a lot of ways, and it's also kept me from being wrong in as many contexts as I used to be, because I wasn't fixated on one way of looking at things. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think community is a vital aspect of our growth, and having the openness of mind and openness of heart to hear where somebody's coming from and to give it validity, even if in that particular moment that's not a perspective that you can say, I'm going to adopt and make this as true for me, but I can accept for them and where they stand, there's validity in this.
Yeah, and well, I think, I think of, Ken Wilber, and he talks about in his story of how he kind of started the integral philosophy, in his own, movement was, he recognized that there was truth in different, in the different social sciences and the different religious traditions and each one was true in its own way.
Right.
And so how do we then, then he was kind of faced with the idea of, well, how do I, bring all this together into a single, system that, that they can all be true at the same time, even when they're in conflict with each other.
Right.
And, and it gives the problem, a sociologist is going to say, no, this is the reason for this. And, psychologist is going to say, no, this is the reason for this. And they're both right at the same time.
Right.
But, finding a way, a system, and that's, and that was a lot of, the foundation of this consciousness work is from that idea that we all are right from our own perspective. And so your perspective is your own, and you can't be wrong in that perspective, though it's not always complete.
Right.
It's right because it's yours and you've experienced it, and that's you, but it's not
virtually
it's
never
complete. Yeah, it can't be complete, because
right.
we're always going to be individuals. I mean, we might get to, I don't know, we might get to a point where we can engulf it all, but there's so much. I mean, how it's an infinite universe, how do we, and both
Right.
big and small, I mean, to be aware of it all at the same time, but that's, working together, we can be more aware. And, and that's all we can strive to do, I think, is, and that's, I guess maybe the goal of consciousness awareness is just to keep expanding that awareness
Mhm.
and expanding our circle of caring and concern, and just keep on being more.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't think there's ever can be a maximum. I think that was one of the mistakes a lot of the wisdom traditions have made over the centuries, is that you get to a point of enlightenment, or that says, boom, I'm there, and you don't have to do any more. I think what this consciousness movement is teaching us is that, no, the more you go up, the more there is.
Right.
And so you just keep going, and there's, there is maybe a level of what we might call enlightenment, but that just opens it up to another level.
Right.
And then there's going to be even another enlightenment on top of that, and another enlightenment on top of that. That was just the first enlightenment. That was
Right.
just the and so we keep going.
Right.
And the potential is just incredible. And I think we as a species are just reaching a place where we can, that anything is possible, that we can transcend our biological limitations and our and our physical limitations to be and to actually then become self-directed. So we can
Right.
stop being controlled by our animal brain,
Right.
and start to be part of this larger thing that and it's just wonderful potential, and it's awe-inspiring for me, and it's I just feel so fortunate to be part of this discussion on consciousness.
Nice. All right, what's next? Let's see. How about, I think it'd be helpful, let's take a few minutes and kind of talk about how we see, we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about raising consciousness. Let's talk about kind of how we see that progressing. If we're going to try and explain that to people, what does that progression look like? What does it mean? There's so much to talk about. I view consciousness, and we've talked about levels of consciousness, we've talked about lenses, and I think for conceptual purposes, it's helpful to maybe use some symbols and metaphors to try and break it down and give a simplistic way of looking at it, and then people can extrapolate from there where that leads them. But I think it's really helpful to think in terms of the levels of consciousness, and to just sort of give a very basic groundwork. Level 1, instinctual level, it's all about survival. I got to make it to see the next day. And then once that's taken care of, then consciousness kind of goes to its next level of preoccupation. This is how I diagram it. The next level is it's all about security. I'm going to live to see tomorrow, but I'm going to have needs in a month. I'm going to have needs in 5 years. I need to start securing my assets, and I need to start securing my future. And that's sort of the security-oriented level of
And it's
consciousness.
very individualistic.
Yes.
I mean, it's very much about the individual.
Right.
It's like my needs, my concerns, my future.
Right.
And that's, and it's so, we're at that level of really strong individualism.
Yeah. And then once it gets that taken care of, then it kind of evolves to the next level, which is sort of a tribal mentality. And consciousness begins to see itself as a part of a larger thing than just one human being. It starts to see itself as part of a group. And then consciousness evolves above that, and it moves to the rational level. It starts operating on abstract principles like truth and justice, and it gets very empirical and pragmatic. Scientific age, that's all an outgrowth of the rational level. And then it moves up to the next level, which is pluralistic, which is very much concerned about love and compassion and valuing other people. And those first 5 levels are in one category I call the competitive range. And then when you bump up to the next level and you move to an integral level of consciousness, you jump this hurdle, which is really significant. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But at the integral level, you start looking at things integrally. You start seeing systematically and holistically, and you start seeing the integration of things in a way that you haven't seen before. And then when consciousness evolves above that, it gets to the transcendent level where it starts to see all of reality as one organic whole expressing itself in limitless ways. Well, this big hurdle, which I think there's possibilities of consciousness, which you've pointed out. There's possibilities of consciousness and horizons that are so far beyond the horizon of this lifetime that I don't even concern myself with them. They're amazing, they're wonderful, they're beautiful, but I'm focused on, what can I do with my life? So I only think about 2 or 3 generations down the road. Beyond that, I think any potential of influence I have will have been subsumed by what everyone else has done. But I think what is a realistic horizon for us to aim for is jumping over that hurdle where we go from pluralistic to integral. And it's a really big hurdle. And the reason it's a big hurdle is this. You can think of each level of consciousness like a tool. And if our goal is to build a house, and that house is live the best life we can live, being the best life for me and the best life for everybody else, if what we're shooting for is building the best house or life we can, you can think of the levels of consciousness like tools in the carpenter's toolbox. One level of consciousness is a hammer. One level of consciousness is a saw. One level of consciousness is a drill. Well, what we have learned through study is the first 5 levels of consciousness, which is up through the pluralistic level. There's this inherent presumption within them that their way of viewing reality is correct. And therefore, somehow there's something wrong with or deficient in the other areas. And we see this a lot of times in a battle between pluralistic. Right now on the world stage, I think the predominant battle, there's a big fight coming from the tribal level, which you see in religious fanaticism. But on the big world stage, between the developed countries, the real battle we're seeing play out is between pluralistic and rational. Historically, well, I guess recently in society, the last several hundred years, the center of mass of consciousness has been tribal. We're now shifting over to where the center of gravity in global consciousness is moving up to the rational level. And so now the major battle, the major push and pull is between the rational level and the pluralistic level. And we see it playing out in the legal system as well. But if you have somebody who's predominantly at the pluralistic level, they're going to look at somebody coming from the rational level and say, man, they're just cold and calculating. They're hard-hearted. They're all about facts. They don't care about people, and they will grind folks into the dust to pursue, their business objective or the bottom line or whatever it may be. Yeah. Whatever the goal is, people will be sacrificed to achieve the objective. You have somebody that comes from primarily the rational level, and they'll look at somebody in the pluralistic level and say, well, they've just got their head in the clouds. They're all about peace and love and flowers and bubbles, but they're not dealing with life as it is.
We live in the real world, and things are hard, and things are,
Exactly. Exactly. And so these first 5 levels, they tend to think they're right, and so they tend to be stuck within their way of viewing the world. But when consciousness hops over to the integral level, it looks back and it sees all these levels, and it realizes, every single one of them is important. And if we were missing any one of them, we'd be in real trouble as a species. So the way I try and express this to people is each level of consciousness is a tool. And if you want to build a really good house, you need to have all those tools. You don't want to be sawing your boards with a hammer, and you don't want to be trying to drive nails with a saw. Each one is well addressed to a specific scenario. And what's really cool is that when we get to the integral level of consciousness, we recognize that, which frees us from the glue of being stuck in our perspective. We're able to say, this situation really calls for a rational response, or this situation really calls for a pluralistic response, or whatever the case may be, and we're able to shift gears. And when we're able to shift gears like that, then we get into a way of problem solving that you can't even come close to until you make that leap into the integral level. Because when you get to that place, everybody starts working on the same team.
Yeah, and I think, a great example of how it was used in the world is South Africa. I mean, these ideas were used by Don Beck and Spiral Dynamics,
Right.
used to organize South Africa post-apartheid.
And you're talking about the truth and reconciliation.
Yeah, truth and reconciliation. But basically, they had to figure out how to do banking in such a way that gave everybody in the society, from very traditional tribal people, and the very rational people and the pluralistic people, each one is looking for a different bank.
Right.
A lot of tribal people don't even see banking as a necessity. It's like
Right.
money isn't really an issue for a lot of, for truly tribal people, so depending on where they're at, so it's, so people are at different places, so they had to figure out, okay, this group likes the bank to look like this. This people, the pluralistic wants convenience and they can do it online, but, more traditional, some people at the traditional level, well, he does a little bit different, he breaks it out a little bit differently, so you have traditional and tribal are two different things, but traditional wants a brick and mortar building, and the tribal level actually doesn't want a bank at all. It was like,
Right.
the money is meaningless.
Right.
So, but they had it all, and so, but he was able, from that perspective, he was able to then kind of figure out how to structure their society so that everybody, there was a place for everybody, and everybody was seen as an integral part of the society,
Right.
and as compared to the apartheid.
Right.
So it's a useful tool, it's a useful way of looking at the world, and it's predictive of how things, how to create new situations and how to fix long-standing issues.
Right.
I believe we can look at it and say, using this model and saying, if we did things this way, but unfortunately this isn't being done. So
Right.
All these conflicts between these different levels, they're all just want to fight each other,
Right.
and not see that there is a place for the people at the pluralistic level want to say everybody, all these, the big corporations, and, it's all about, they're just evil. Well, no, they have a role to play.
Right.
They're not evil. They have a role to play.
Right.
But there's, and it's, so it's finding that, seeing that and learning how to, so that all these different people can work together and
Right.
we have a common goal. But, then that's, a lot of this is, creating a vision so people can see that their place in it,
Right.
and feel like they're not threatened by those other people
Right.
at different levels, and I think it's important to point out that these different levels, even though we talk about them hierarchically, one is not better necessarily than
Right.
the other. That these are just, and I always like to use the idea of that this level of complexities.
Right.
Each level can handle a different level of complexity.
Right.
And so the more complex the world gets, the higher we need to be. And
Right.
the more complex society gets, we have to keep, expanding. And then, we can talk about it, these levels as, individually, and they also apply to a society. There are
Right.
different levels of groups within the society,
Right.
and nothing ever goes away.
Right.
In us or within society. We still have tribal societies within, gangs, and, or a tribal society within the larger society. And, we still have family structures, we still have all these different structures, all together at the same time,
Right.
and all accessible at the same time, just as like they're all accessible within each one of us
Right.
at the same time.
Right.
So that, but when you reach integral level, you can pick and choose.
Right.
You can then say, oh, I want to respond from this level.
Right.
I want to respond from this level. But most people, below integral level aren't able to do that.
Right.
And because they can't see them.
Right.
And as soon as they start to, then they start, that's their consciousness is raising.
Right.
So, but at that level, generally, they don't see that how to respond differently. They can respond to children differently and
Right.
recognize that you respond to children, but not adults.
Yeah.
Depending on where they're at.
Yeah.
And so, That's often why I use the model of child development to understand, the larger human development
Yeah.
and spiritual development.
Yeah. Well, you really, you really started my wheels spinning. There's a lot of connections in what you said. I mean, what you said is very profound. A lot of connections. I want to kind of go back and talk a little bit about some of the things that you mentioned. One of the things you've actually segued very nicely between two questions that we're chewing on. One is, why should higher consciousness matter to the average person? And then the other is a question that we're going to talk about later, is what would a society built on integral principles look like? And you've tied those together beautifully. The thing that you were talking about in South Africa, I want to go back and dig a little deeper on that. When people wonder, why should I care about consciousness? Well, South Africa went from an apartheid system to basically a democracy. And you had a very constricted, controlled source of power in that country, and it was essentially overthrown. Now, historically, what happens is when you overthrow a concentrated source of power, there's a bloodbath. That's just the way that it's been done in human history all the way up until the present age. So what's really cool is, in my understanding of what happened with the work there and Beck and Spiral Dynamics and the people that worked on that, the initial human impetus at the time was, we've thrown off our oppressors, now we need to have justice and redress some of these grievances. But fortunately, they slowed down and they listened long enough, and when they started looking at an integral approach, and they were asked the question, what does the future look like to you, and what do you want the future to look like? When they got them out of the past and the emotion, and they started looking at the bigger picture, both sides, the repressed and the previous oppressors, recognized the only way they could get to the future they both wanted was if they worked together. And when they saw that, they said, okay, now we need to do a different approach than the bloodletting. Let's have this Truth and Reconciliation Act, where the people who did wrong, the oppressors that abused people, come and admit what they've done, said, this is what I've done, I'm sorry for it, here's some of the pain that they caused from the oppressed, and then forgiveness happened, and they pull together and work. And what you had is, rather than civil war and a bloodbath and a lot of people getting killed, you have a peaceful transition, and they probably saved 80 years of utter chaos and turmoil in South Africa. So if you ask a South African, what does consciousness mean to me? That's what it means. It means you get to live in a country, you get to go straight into the modern age instead of being engulfed in a civil war and murder and mayhem and losing a lot of people you love and care about. You get to bypass all that and go right to a peaceful society that's operating in that's operating in the modern age. And that's part of, too, what we will see when we have integral societies that are thinking in these ways. They're looking at new solutions. They're looking to grow beyond the past. And I'm seeing we're going to have to break here pretty soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, I love that model of from South Africa, and there's so many wonderful stories of forgiveness and understanding as well, from those that were oppressed, that their oppressors were oppressed by their system as well. Right. Because they were kind of forced to be the oppressor. Right. By society, pushed them into this role, and they didn't really have a lot of choice in that matter. I mean, they were kind of, without the awareness of it, they became oppressors without ever really choosing to be oppressors. Right. Because the system was in place, they just kind of grew into it, and so I think, because I think what those people who had been oppressed were able to see was their humanity, because they saw that many were actually very pained by what they were doing.
Mhm.
You know, and I think we see this in our, you know, I think we need to understand this. One of the conflicts in our country right now is, we're seeing shootings by the police. And I think, you know, it's seen something similar, is that we need to understand that many of these police officers have been put in this situation. They don't want to be doing this.
Right.
It doesn't make them happy. It's not pleasurable to be so violent, but the system has brought them to this place.
Right.
And that, you know, we need to recognize, see their humanity, and to address them as humans if we're going to change things. If we
Right.
keep on seeing them as the oppressive police and see them, you know, and that's just going to create a barrier. The
Right.
barrier will be increased, and it'll lead to more violence. But to see their humanity and to address their humanity, and that's the way forward. In what one of our issues going on in this country right now is, you know, is just recognizing their humanity and treating them as humans. And, you know, we see pictures every so often of protests and somebody giving flowers to police officers, you know, who are there with their, you know, their riot gear, and people recognizing, and it's one of the things we need to do more of, is
Yeah.
to see that.
Yeah.
And because, you know, once you recognize that dual, each one is either, that oppression can't exist for much
Right.
longer once that happens.
Right.
And that's why, you know, I mean, the other example of this, or similar example, would be in India with Gandhi's movement, you know, of nonviolent, it just kind of created the condition that you could have a transition without, you know, the long-term war.
Yeah.
You were able to have a peaceful shift, you know, in that transition. And, you know, and I wish that a lot of these ideas had been around in Gandhi's time to be implemented in India, you know, as they were progressing, you know, forward, that so maybe that would have alleviated some of their issues as they move forward, and understanding their different levels of consciousness in their own society.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's probably sounds like a good stopping point.
Yeah.
Could use your battery, I think so too.